You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
Welcome everyone to episode 236. And the big change, as you noticed over the past couple of episodes, is we now have intro music on the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Only took me 230 episodes. And I owe a big thank you to musician Matthew Bankert for putting together that intro music for me. That was an instrumental sample from one of his songs. Matthew's a really good musician and has a pretty good anti-war song out there, Send in the Tanks. And I'm going to link to that on the show notes page. And, that way, those of you who want to go and listen to the song and check out Matthew's work, I feel like, being a foreign policy non-interventionist show, the anti-war song is probably the best one for y'all to check out first. So, you can find that on the show notes page, which of course could be found at thelibertarianinstitute.org or foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Now, I've actually had the intro music for about 3 episodes. However, I had pre-recorded those episodes because I was doing some traveling over the past week, so I got some news to catch y'all up on. I did hope everybody enjoyed those shows that I did while I was out. The pre-recorded ones with Scott Horton on Trump's Afghan war. I think that's one of the more important shows that I've done in quite some time. And then I also discussed Austrian economics and war with Stephen Clyde, who's the host of the Peace and Liberty podcast. While I mostly focus on, kind of what happens overseas and the, direct results of our foreign policy there, it's also important to remember that, when you're talking to the average American, most of us, our friends, our neighbors, our family, whatever, what they're most concerned about is what's happening here at home. And, if we're really going to be able to sell some of these points to them, being able to talk about what me and Steven talked about on that show, explaining how spending $700 billion on defense has all these terrible repercussions for the entire U.S. economy, and it makes us all so much poorer, are very important points to make. So I hope you all listen to those shows, and I hope that show wasn't too libertarian, because I know I don't have a full libertarian audience, but again, I think it's pretty important information. So I was going to start off on today's show just by quickly touching on this Paul Manafort conviction thing, because during my travels, I caught a little bit more mainstream media than I usually catch. I never watch those channels here at home, but, sometimes when you're out and about, somebody has it on, and, everybody's making a big deal out of Paul Manafort being convicted of these 8 counts, and they're mostly corruption type charges, or fraud charges, I guess. And this stems from Paul Manafort just being kind of a dirty actor in tax evasion type stuff. I'm not surprised that Paul Manafort is guilty of this, and I'm sure he's guilty of a lot more of these similar charges. However, I guess the most important thing here is it had nothing to do with 2016, and it had nothing to do with the Russia situation. And in fact, I believe he's going to have another trial coming up here in a couple months, and those charges will be related to the time that he was working and peddling some influence in tax evasion in Ukraine. However, at that time, he was actually lobbying and looking to sway politicians against the Russian position and to take a bailout austerity deal with the West rather than taking the one with Russia. So I guess this is a good time just to remind my listeners here that while I've, long said that I don't think there's anything kind of behind these Russiagate charges, and there's certainly been no proof of anything there, it doesn't mean that Donald Trump, Paul Manafort, Michael Cohen, and all these other people aren't guilty as hell of a ton of crimes. I'm not saying that none of them may not even be guilty and, have done some illegal business with Russia at any point in time. But none of that has to do with the 2016 election, and there's been no evidence of whatever kind of collusion or, kind of the general story that Russia hacked the DNC emails and then released them in coordination with the Trump administration to help Trump win the presidency. That claim is still well far away from being proved, and there's nothing really that's even gone to, provide any evidence to make that case. But there is some evidence that Paul Manafort is guilty of things, and I can't imagine that Trump isn't guilty of some of these kind of crimes either. It'll be interesting to see how this develops, and you would think it would almost dilute the Russiagate narrative at this point. That if after all this time, all they're able to prove is that, what everybody already knew about Paul Manafort, and that's he's dirty. He violates the law. He goes around tax laws and, makes money for himself and other rich people at times at the expense of the less well off. So not a good guy. Probably going to be doing some jail time, and we'll see how this all works out for him. Next, I want to talk about Senator Rand Paul, who, man, if he had been the senator he has been in the past couple of months here, he may have won the 2015-2016 election. He is really showing himself to be an outsider determined to stand up for what he believes is true, what he sees as the correct path, and for looking not for hostility with other nations, but with peace, cooperation, and trade. He made that trip to Russia, and I thought that was a big deal just because everybody is going to accuse him of being a Russian puppet. I mean, John McCain even did it on the Senate floor just because Rand Paul didn't want Montenegro into NATO. But he made that trip. He, I guess, gave a letter to Vladimir Putin from Donald Trump, and over this past weekend, I guess that earned him a round of golf with Donald Trump. I think the important thing here is that if Rand Paul has Donald Trump's ear, we know that Rand Paul does stand in good positions on most of these war issues. I know that during the 2016 election, he was talking about arming the Kurds, and that's not a good thing. But he is very much against the war in Afghanistan, the war in Yemen, the war in Syria, the terror and drone wars in Africa. And so, him having Donald Trump's ear is a very good thing. And, as Trump looks and sees that his Afghan war over the past year has failed, Rand Paul can influence and nudge Trump in the right direction on a situation like that. I'll get a little bit into later in the show what another plan is. So one of the things that Rand Paul was apparently going to push for during his round of golf with Donald Trump was taking away sanctions on Russian lawmakers who wished to come to the United States to talk to U.S. senators. Rand actually appeared on an episode of his father's Liberty Report to discuss his trip to Russia and explained that many of these Russian congressional leaders actually speak English so they could come to the United States. And, even if they don't speak in front of the full Senate or the House, they could speak in front of the foreign relation committees or whatever other committees seem appropriate for this kind of thing, and explain the Russian position on these issues to the U.S. senators, who I'm sure, much like the rest of the American people, really have only consumed mainstream type media sources and believe that Russia is just a evil force in the world looking to undermine democracy. And maybe these Russian politicians are the ones that could put it in context and say, no, look, this is what we want, this is what our issues are. Because I think once that happens, these U.S. lawmakers are going to see that Russia's positions and what they're looking for isn't too much different from what the United States wants in many cases. And they may understand why Russia is drawing the lines that they're choosing to draw, because I don't think they're too absurd or anything like that, especially when you look at what's happened in Syria or Ukraine. Now, Rand Paul, speaking, I think at the Foreign Relations Committee, was talking about how Russia and the U.S. sanctions policy against Russia, if you look at how this has worked, it's been a cycle of the United States puts more sanctions, more pressure, or kits like Russian ambassadors out of the United States. And in response, Russia does the same thing back, and things just keep moving more and more in that direction. And as these two countries move diplomatically further apart, it's one of those things where the counter is that we move closer and closer towards confrontation. It seems that Rand Paul is about the only person in the, as an elected U.S. politician that's really put effort into trying to find some solutions here and to make this thing go in a better direction. And one of the ways he's doing this is trying to bring, as I said, some Russians to the United States. And one of the things I'm sure they will talk about is the NATO expansion issue. And Rand Paul mentioned that, hey, the sanctions aren't working. That's a stick. We need some carrots. And one of the carrots that we could offer is by saying we're not going to allow Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. Now, these countries sit right on Russia's border. This is Russia's Canada and Mexico, and they're saying absolutely not. We will not allow these countries to join NATO. I don't know if they're going to go to nuclear war over it, but they're certainly going to look to undermine that and, possibly use military intervention to do so. And I think Rand Paul makes a good point that, hey, if we could agree to something that Russia isn't already going to allow and doesn't provide any benefit to the United States, why would bringing these countries into NATO help the U.S.? Nobody is really able to explain. All it would do is push NATO really all the way through Russia's doorstep and would just lead the United States into potential confrontation with Russia. That's completely unnecessary. And if you look at the fact that Ukraine's military is infiltrated and infested with neo-Nazis, do you even want these forces and factions inside of NATO? I think the answer to that would be obviously no. This is something that's going to draw Rand Paul a lot of criticism. So I think it's important that, when we can and when you think about it, to show him a little support on this kind of issue, just because, if you remember the vote on having Montenegro be allowed into NATO, he was called a, traitor to the American people, in kind of out of the corner of John McCain's mouth on the Senate floor. So, these are important things that, Rand Paul needs to see some support on to continue. And it's good that at least one senator is standing up and trying to do something. And hopefully we can have some of these joint meetings between the United States and Russians and bring some people together and improve the situation here. North Korea, there's a couple stories I want to talk about. One is that you have South Koreans now traveling to North Korea for some of these reunification meetings where basically, I guess, a son of a woman is able to go and meet his mom. She's been living in North Korea for these 70 years. He's been living in South Korea, and they finally get to see each other. There's siblings that are separated and all kinds of different people. So this is like a great moment, no matter what your feelings are on the overall Korean peace process. But I do think it does assist the Korean peace process, just because, these pictures will be seen by a lot of people. And I think they'll show that, this is just the Korean people, and, there's no reason for this hostility and for one of the sides of the Korean peninsula to be that much poorer than the other side. North Korea is facing, I guess, some food shortage problems and potentially starvation, and U.S. aid and U.S. sanctions are continuing to be very strict on North Korea and are preventing this food aid from getting into the country. So very unfortunate how much people are suffering there. And as I've talked about on the show in the past, these sanctions campaigns and regimes don't work. And, maybe the United States could seize upon this opportunity and say, hey, Kim, I see some of your people are starving. We'll relax these food aid sanctions, but, this means that you gotta give up A, B, or C. And, maybe it's one of their rockets, maybe it's one of their nuclear weapons, maybe they'd agree to turn off a nuclear reactor or something like that. But this is a place where we could start to move in the right direction. Now, I think the unfortunate thing is Donald Trump has long said that I'm not going to take any sanctions off North Korea unless they completely denuclearize, which just isn't the way I think these negotiations are going to have to go if they're going to be successful. And that's going to be, each country taking a step. And sometimes that means the United States may step first to show the North Koreans that they're serious about this peace process. Now in Afghanistan, we had the potential for a ceasefire coming up for another Islamic holiday month, but the Taliban had rejected the offer from the Afghan government. I guess this can't be seen as too surprising. The Taliban are kind of in a successful offensive right now. They've taken a whole lot of territory. They held the city of Ghazi for a few days, which is a pretty important city in kind of south central Afghanistan on the road to Kabul. And so, any kind of ceasefire would probably just allow the Afghan army and the United States kind of regroup and pit some new Taliban targets for after the ceasefire. This is what happened last time, if you remember. There was a ceasefire, and then right after, the U.S. carried out a bunch of airstrikes. So I'm sure that's something that would dissuade the Taliban from accepting this peace offer again. Now, it's not just that the Taliban accepted it because it was expected they wouldn't, but they actually flat out rejected it. And so this may be a reflection of their confidence in the successes of this year's spring offensive that, continues to roll on, or, turned off by the way that the United States handled the last ceasefire. Now, I believe there are some talks scheduled again for September between the United States and Taliban officials. So hopefully, some kind of deal could be worked out here, or the United States could just leave. Now, former Blackwater head and now the head of whatever group he changed the name to, Eric Prince, the mercenary man, is once again trying to push Trump towards taking one of his plans to wage the Afghan war. This would focus on using air power, special forces, and contractors in the country, saying that we're really going to reduce the footprint of either American soldiers or contractors. Sometimes I think libertarians make a little bit of a miscalculation saying, well, a private war is better than one that's public, but at the end of the day, the public's paying for it and it would have to be approved by Donald Trump and, he would be able to change it at any time. So it's really just going to be a public war anyways. It's just going to have less oversight because it's done through kind of a proxy private company. Of course, when a company receives most or all of their money from the government, they can't really be considered a private company, since any change of government policy would, really change their balance sheet. They would, lobby and, add just like a government bureaucracy would, trying to do the things that gets them the most funding from the government. But it is concerning that as the war has failed, that Eric Prince is again trying to get Trump's ear to pitch this plan. Hopefully, Trump goes with whatever Rand Paul is telling him, which is to end the war and not going with, this plan. But, this is a kind of scary one that could be enticing to somebody like Donald Trump, just because I really don't think he understands everything about, how wars work and how these mercenary groups work, and probably is too trusting of Eric Prince. But hopefully he rejects this plan. I did see something that John Bolton was, didn't hate it. Some news out of Iraq. The Supreme Court has ratified the election results from the May election. If you guys remember, I've talked about this on the show a few times as it's developed, that originally Muqtada al-Sadr had actually taken the plurality of votes in the election, and then there was some complaining that some of the election results were rigged, particularly some of the results coming out of Kurdistan. The Supreme Court ordered, I believe, a full recount of the election ballots, and then just the suspect ballots. There was some reporting that one of the elections ballot storage facilities had been raided and destroyed by protesters. But whatever happened, the Supreme Court now says that the results we have are ratified. We're sticking with them. And again, al-Sadr is the plurality vote holder. I still haven't seen, anything conclusive on what Sadr is going to do with his plurality of votes for selecting the new prime minister. Everybody says that Sadr is not himself going to run for prime minister and is in more of a kingmaker role, although him and even, one other Iraqi political faction don't have enough votes to actually elect a prime minister themselves, and would require votes from other factions as well. One person it seems will not be the next prime minister is the current prime minister, Abadi. He's taken some steps recently to start to enforce U.S. sanctions against Iran in Iraq, and this is going to be problematic for Iraq and really hurt the Iraqi people. Iraq is, relying pretty heavily on Iran right now for support, especially, I believe, for electricity. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens, moving forward between Abadi and Iraq and Iran. Now, one thing that seems to me to, possibly be a play here is that Abadi is looking to say, well, I didn't win the election, but if I win the support of the Americans, then maybe I have a chance to remain prime minister. It does seem like the kind of thing the U.S. would do. We have a statement from the U.S. military saying that they plan to stay in Iraq as long as they are needed. They didn't really give the overall, these are the 5 things that we need to see from Iraq to know it's time to go home. But it does seem like just their way of saying that they're going to be staying in the country forever. And, I don't know, for those of us observers of foreign policy, I guess we're probably all not very surprised by that. 2 more stories out of Africa, and then I'll wrap up the rest of the news I missed over the past week on Friday. And that is in Niger. I've read reports that the government there is actually suppressing protesters who are in opposition to the United States military presence and our drone base in that country. We now have armed drones in Niger. And so, this again is just a reflection of how U.S. foreign policy continues to pretend to be, the force for good overseas, but then now we're in a position where the dictator of a country is suppressing his own people so we could keep our fancy drone base in his country. And then in Mali, we had the president of that country reelected. And I think if anybody reads through this story, basically what happened is that tons and tons of people in the country were afraid to go out and vote because the polling sites were being attacked by different either Islamist or militant groups. And so, while the United States is always so heavy on we have to have elections, we have to have democracy around the world, in some places it just doesn't work and it doesn't bring a consensus government to power. It brings a government to power that's, corrupted. And, it doesn't reflect the will of the people or anything like that. Well, in some countries like the United States, democracy might not work too poorly, but in some countries it works really poorly and seems to only invite more violence. All right, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, Facebook is Libertarian Union. Twitter is at KYAAALE. My news website is immersionnews.com. Check that out, everyone. Really cool stuff going on there. And then the YouTube and BitChute pages are Immersion News. And if you like the show and really want to support it, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Thanks, everyone.